Okay, good evening and welcome to the fourth session of the Henry George School's Spring 2022 course on modern money theory. Can you just raise your hand to guarantee that you're hearing me? Okay, thank you. So this week we pick up our pace and we cover two chapters in Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth rather than just one. Those chapters are chapter 3, The National Debt That Isn't, and chapter 4, Their Red Ink is Our Black Ink. Now, here the material starts to get wonkier. Unemployment is an issue that cuts across a wide swath of the population. Inflation, even more so, as we are currently learning or perhaps relearning. But a problem like that of the alleged burden of the national debt is one that mainly gets discussed in what I will call elite discourse, that is, in business circles and in Washington, D.C. That means that you, as students, are going to have to dig in a bit deeper to understand the material. So, recall the three phrases that I asked you to keep in mind back in week number 1. What does happen? What can happen? What should happen? Chapters 3 and 4 are primarily concerned with what does happen. That is, they're concerned with the way government spending, taxation, and financing actually work. When we view the government through the MMT lens, we see that things work differently from the way that they are described in economics textbooks, in the media, and in national politics. Now, to frame Stephanie Kelton's discussion in chapters 3 and 4, I'd like to start off with a brief look at what I call the MMT theory of the state. I will have 3 propositions. Number 1, the state mobilizes resources in pursuit of the public purpose. Let me just repeat that once. The state mobilizes resources in pursuit of the public purpose. Here, we use the term the state in the way that political scientists use it, government in its most general sense, the entity that makes, enforces, and adjudicates law. If we want to refer to states of the United States, we will get specific. How that, quote, public purpose, end quote, is defined and who gets to do the defining, those are topics for a separate discussion. 2, the state generally prefers to mobilize these resources in a stable manner perceived as lawful. States could simply plunder resources from the populations they govern, but that system wouldn't be very stable. States could mobilize those resources via slave labor, but with the exception of prison labor, that's viewed as retrograde. If the state only needed a limited range of resources, it could impose a tax to be paid in those resources, a tax in kind, such as in cattle, but that would quickly fail to scale. So 3, a state can mobilize resources by issuing currency for the purchase of resources and simultaneously imposing a tax obligation in that currency. The tax obligation creates an incentive for the population to acquire the currency in which the taxes must be paid. That currency can be obtained by producing goods and services that can be sold to the state in return for that currency. That implies that the state must issue the currency and make it available to the population via state spending before the population can pay taxes with it. For monetarily sovereign, currency issuing governments, spending precedes taxation, not the other way around. This further implies that taxation must serve purposes other than amassing funds prior to spending. In week 2, we saw that Kelton identifies at least 4 purposes of taxation. one of which purposes is to ensure that some production of goods and services in the non government sector is available for the state's provisioning of itself. Now, you might well ask, does a monetarily sovereign government need to borrow before it spends? If not, why does it borrow at all? The answer modern money theory provides is no. A monetarily sovereign currency issuing government does not need to amass funds via borrowing before it can spend. Hence, what we commonly call government borrowing, and when I use the term borrowing this evening, it will almost always be in air quotes. Borrowing must have purposes other than amassing funds prior to spending. At the end of chapter 4, Kelton identifies one of the reasons for that borrowing, an activity which would be better described as sales of debt instruments. That purpose is to drain reserves from the banking system and to prevent an infusion of reserves from driving interest rates below the Federal Reserve's target level. Now, that is a wonkish mouthful, and I'm not going to attempt a detailed explanation right now. We'll come upon that in the discussion questions. Now, when we study political economy, we have to develop a facility for thinking and talking about the economy in shorthand fashion. This is as true in modern money theory as in any other approach to macroeconomics. In chapter 4, Kelton introduces what we'll call a two sector model of the economy, an economy with a government sector, which is a currency issuer, and a non government sector, which is a currency user. She then depicts the flows of currency between these sectors as flows of water between two buckets. When you reach this part of the deficit myth, I strongly advise you to get a few pieces of paper and pen or pencil and draw those buckets yourself. Teach yourself this stock flow modeling of the economy and get it into your muscle memory. Those of you who have grandchildren, have your grandchildren get out their crayons and have them draw these buckets as well. Use that as an opportunity to discuss the economy with them. I assure you that in drawing these buckets, they will pick up what MMT is saying about the economy much better than the average member of the United States Congress does. Let's now turn to our discussion questions for chapters 3 and 4. Note that I've included a bonus question for chapter 3 based on political developments in the past week. Uh, I'll be trying to reach everybody who's in the Zoom window at least once with a question. But because we're covering two chapters this week, and because I really want to allocate time for the bonus question, I will be moving the discussion along a bit more briskly than I've done in the past 2 weeks. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So let's turn to our discussion questions, which are posted in the Slack channel and also at the learner-minsky.org website. Um, the we begin, as we frequently do, with questions that are strictly definitional, where I ask you to explain terminology that is used by Stephanie Kelton in Chapter 3 of the Deficit Myth. And uh, I will I'll actually combine several terms into one. Stephanie Kelton uses the terms deficit hawks, deficit doves, and deficit owls. Um, Let me call upon Peter Lugton. Can you describe what Stephanie means by deficit hawks, deficit doves, and deficit owls? Peter Lugton, can you unmute?
There we
Yes.
go. Okay, yeah, I was having a problem there. Okay, yeah, so the deficit hawks are people that obviously think that the government should not run up deficits under any circumstances because government borrowing is evil. The definite deficit doves are still people that believe that the deficits are harmful, but are more prepared to allow a deficit spending for good causes. And the deficit owls, Stephanie Kelton defined those as wise people that could see all around where the money was going in and going out, which bucket it was going into and coming out of, so as to get a balanced picture of the whole economy, the government deficit becoming a private sector surplus.
Okay. Very good. Um, let me call upon Alex Sukatos for the next term, meganumophobia. Can you describe what Kelton means by meganumophobia? And remember to unmute.
I'll be guessing because I underlined it. I remembered and then I forgot about it. But, being very afraid of anything new.
No, that's not quite right.
Okay.
Ruth Kanu, can you take a stab at meganumophobia?
It's the way that the deficit hawks and the deficit doves paint the deficit in sort of horrific terms so that the public gets really, really scared of it, and they think the nation has to find a way to eliminate this debt, or they and their children will be responsible for it.
Okay, but what specifically is the element of fear there, or the element of fright?
Well, they work it out so they show the numbers of the deficit with all the zeros so that people really think it's horrible.
Yes. Meganumophobia, fear of large numbers. Okay. All right, let's move on. Explain Stephanie Kelton's conclusion that the U.S. national debt poses. Before I do that, I'll just cite that deficit hawks and meganumophobia. All that's between pages 75 and 79 or so in the deficit myth. Okay, next question. Explain Kelton's conclusion that the U.S. national debt poses no financial burden whatsoever. Kay Lasker, can you take on that question?
I just joined the group. I'm really not up to date on the material.
Okay, so we'll pass and try to catch up on the reading and particularly that question next week because that explains a lot about this book. Bonnie, can you tackle that question? Give in your own terms, what is Kelton's conclusion that the U.S. national debt poses no financial burden whatsoever?
I'm sorry, I unmuted and then muted again. Because Stephanie Kelton says that the US government is the issuer of its own currency. So it could pay off the debt anytime it wanted to by issuing, well, somehow by buying it all back. I can't remember. Well, there's a danger with that. She says there's a big danger with not carrying any debt, but that's another subject. So the debt is no burden because the government can handle it itself. It can,
Yes.
well, I can't think of the right terminology. It was a bit confusing. And later on, I'd like you to explain the difference between green and yellow
Oh,
dollars. That was very confusing. But anyway, it's not a problem because the the government issues the currency, so it can deal with the debt.
okay. Okay. Um, is there anybody right now who would like to, who knows what Stephanie Kelton is talking about in green green dollars and yellow dollars, who would like to uh, fill us in on that?
Yeah, I could do that.
Okay,
Yeah, there's Marty Rowland.
that's Marty. Yes.
So let's see, that was the question about the sale of US treasuries and not borrowing. Was that the question?
Well,
Or
I'm
that
actually
national debt? No.
I'm
Okay.
actually asking if you can directly clarify the question that Bonnie just asked about Kelton's use of the terminology green dollars and yellow dollars.
Yeah, I can do that. So I wrote my little answer here. It says that despite the CBO talking about a debt clock that displays a historical record of how many dollars federal government added to the people's pocket without taxing them away, those are dollars saved as US treasuries, and these are yellow dollars. So actually, it's a savings clock, not a debt.
Okay. Okay, so we're accustomed to thinking of uh, U.S. currency as being green, as in greenbacks or anything like that. Now, I have I don't think I've ever actually seen a U.S. Treasury bond. I don't know if they are actually printed with yellow ink, uh, uh, but uh, let's say for the purpose of argument they does. That's why Stephanie Kelton would say you have green dollars, which are issued by the government and which are non-interest bearing notes, and you have the bonds that uh, nowadays I'm sure that the overwhelming majority of treasury bonds are simply digital entries uh, rather than actually printed bond certificates. Uh, but if imagine them just being a different form of U.S. currency. Bonnie, does that help you?
To a certain extent, but she said that the Chinese government has a checking account at the Federal Reserve. Well, I found that very confusing. And that was supposedly the green dollars, which when they buy treasuries, they turn into yellow dollars. What does she mean that the Chinese government has a checking account at the Federal Reserve? I found this very confusing.
Uh, well, the Federal Reserve is a central bank, which means that it's a bank for banks.
Yeah,
So far, so good.
yeah.
So that uh, Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Bank of America, uh, uh, Amalgamated Bank of New York. If they're members of the Federal Reserve System, they have accounts at uh, at the Federal Reserve, and they use those accounts to rectify balances amongst each other. The banks settle up with one another via moving funds in and out of their accounts at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve also functions um, as the bank. It's also the bank for the United States Treasury, and hence uh, bank bank transactions. Uh, when say a bank buys a treasury bond, uh, it settles with its reserve accounts, reserve balances at the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve can, and I assume does, hold accounts for foreign countries, so that when foreign countries settle with either the United States Treasury or when they settle with United States banks, and when the accounts that need to be settled are in U.S. dollars, those are simply settled by movements of account within the Federal Reserve. Are you with me so far?
Yes, yes, that's
Okay.
very helpful.
Okay. So in effect, China and any other country and any other bank has an account at the Federal Reserve. And in it, this is and we refer to this as a checking account. And here we're sort of thinking of checking accounts the way that they were maybe, 30 or 40 years ago, when checking accounts did not receive interest. They were not interest bearing. 30 or 40 years ago, if you went to a commercial bank and you wanted interest, you had to get a time deposit, a savings deposit. And a bond is simply a different form of a time deposit, or a savings deposit. It's interest bearing. And so when, say, China sells a lot of goods to the United States, basically what happens in banking terms is that its account at the Federal Reserve gets credited. At least I assume that it's on that side of the ledger, so it's credited. And so China has an increase in these assets that are United States currency, but are not interest bearing. Those are the green dollars. China, like anybody else who's holding dollars, may want to exchange those non-interest bearing assets for an interest bearing asset, the safest of which is United States Treasuries, which is what Stephanie Kelton refers to as yellow dollars. So China having an account and being able to switch between green dollars and yellow dollars is no different fundamentally from any bank that's a member of the Federal Reserve System being able to do that. And if at some point in the future the laws change such that the Federal Reserve can offer digital accounts to any U.S. citizen, then we too will be able to switch between green dollars and yellow dollars. Does that help?
Yes, that makes it much more clear. A quick question though, when China's selling goods to the U.S., they're not selling the goods to the government or to the Federal Reserve. They're selling the goods to American businesses, right?
Yeah, like Walmart. I guess Walmart has an account with a major bank, which has an account with the Federal Reserve. So eventually, that's how these accounts get settled eventually. And the trade surplus is the overall surplus, vis-a-vis all the U.S. companies. China's surplus.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on. The next question, explain why, per Kelton, we should not refer to the sale of U.S. Treasuries as, quote, borrowing, end quote, or label those securities as, quote, the national debt. William Batt, would you like to try to explain Kelton's reasoning there?
Yeah, I had to unmute. Well, because the government can print the money, it's not really borrowing it. It's just making more available. And what was the last half of the question? I can't remember.
Why should we not refer to the sale of U.S. Treasuries as borrowing?
Well, as I said, it's not borrowing because the government is not taking it from someplace or paying interest on it. It's just printing more.
Well, I think that actually they do pay interest on the bonds that they
Oh,
sell.
I didn't realize you were talking about bonds.
Yeah,
okay.
U.S. sale of U.S. Treasuries, Treasuries being the common term for bonds. Michael Leroy, would you like to take a stab at that question?
Well, I basically think what William Batt said. Really, he's that they're issuing the money, and therefore they're not. When they issue, they pay interest on yellow dollars certainly, but they don't pay interest on green dollars. Green dollars are the free issue in the economy, and unless you get someone to pay interest for borrowing those particularly, you're not borrowing. You're not borrowing.
Okay. Why do you think she considers the term the national debt to be misleading?
Misleading.
Because it's not owed.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, that would be reasonable to say.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, I feel that there was something missing from the responses, but I can't really put my finger on it now. So I'm just going to go on to the next question.
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Yes.
Aren't you referring to the fact that she looks upon the fact that they're actually creating a surplus in the private sector?
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Okay.
It's also that it's a policy choice.
Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm not satisfied with my own wording of the question, so I'm going to leave it at that. Let's go on to the next one. Under what circumstances does an investor take on default risk when purchasing bonds issued by her own country's treasury and denominated in her country's currency? James Frederickson, would you like to attempt to answer that question?
Well, my attempted answer would be if the government refuses to raise the debt limit.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other circumstance?
Can I jump in?
Or let me,
Oh.
James, let me rephrase that. In the United States, we have a situation where one of the self-imposed rules that Congress has made with regard to financing the government is the limit on the national debt. But that is, as I just mentioned, a self-imposed rule that Congress could change, and it's also very particular to the United States. Setting aside something like that, where some people in Congress might want to grandstand by filibustering to refuse to raise the national debt limit. Apart from that, is there any other circumstance where an investor would take on default risk in purchasing bonds issued by her own country's treasury and denominated in her own country's currency?
The only thing I could think of would be the failure of the government to limit inflation.
Okay, but would that be default risk?
No.
I can't think of exactly how it would be default risk, no.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, what James mentioned was that the government could sell bonds, and then if there were an extreme inflationary period, when the principal of the bonds is repaid 5 or 10 years down the road, the purchasing power of the dollars that the investor would receive in return for the bonds would be much less. That's an inflation risk, but it's not a default risk. The point being that the country issuing bonds in their own currency, they can always pay them off, so there's no default risk in those bonds. Okay, at least there's no risk of involuntary default. a couple times a year now, we go through this song and dance in Congress where the party in opposition might say, well, we're going to refuse to raise the limit on the federal debt. And there's this, it creates a big furor in the press and so forth. If that were actually to come to pass, that would be a voluntary default on the debt, but it would not be an involuntary default, and that's what we're more concerned with. Okay, a similar question. Under what circumstances would a country that only, quote, borrows, that is, that only sells debt instruments in its own currency, be forced to accept a market-determined rate of interest? Joe Polito.
Sorry, what was that?
The question is, under what circumstances would a country that only borrows, that is, only sells debt instruments in its own currency, be forced to accept a market-determined rate of interest? This is obviously per Stephanie Kelton.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't make sense to me. But at any rate, I'll have to pass.
Okay. David Johnson. Can you answer that question?
I'm afraid I would have to pass on that too.
Okay. Lucas.
Yeah. According to a nation that does that would not have to. They control the rate of interest on the bonds by selling or purchasing them. That's one mechanism. The other way to control the reserves is paying interest on the reserves. So I think as per her, there's no need of that. Or they can establish an interest rate on their own, whatever interest rate they want. And so I think in that question, the answer is they don't.
That is correct. That is precisely correct.
And while I've got you, Joe, the question I have, the question I have is, Ms. Kelton often says, for example, if the reserves get too high, say financial deficits to get too high, and the reserves get too large, it can drive down the interest rate. Would it be a more accurate statement for her to say it has a tendency to drive down the overnight rate? Is that the interest rate she's talking about? There's many interest rates on bonds, on overnight rates, and that one confuses me. When she says, for example, if the Federal Reserve, the fiscal deficit is very high, the Federal Reserves get high, and I know they control that with bond sales or purchases. But is that the interest rate she's talking about driving down the overnight rate?
Yes, in most cases that she's talking about the overnight rate,
okay,
which in the United States is often referred to as the federal funds rate.
Okay,
and,
to you that would be clear when you're reading it. I found that very confusing as to exactly which one she was referring to. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that the Federal Reserve is a bank for banks, and that different banks and indeed the banks of foreign countries, the central banks of foreign countries, have accounts at the Fed, and they settle up amongst each other by movements of their accounts at the Federal Reserve, which are known as reserves. They have to meet certain legal requirements, some of which are reserves as a percentage of deposits, at least in the United States, that's the law, or capital ratios. And so consequently, they have to watch the balance of their accounts at the Federal Reserve, but they, for the purposes of satisfying legal requirements and Federal Reserve requirements, they can borrow reserves from other banks. And this is frequently done just overnight. and the rate of interest that that a bank would charge if it was lending money to another bank just overnight would be the federal funds rate, and that tends to serve as the basis for all interest rates in the system. Now, um, let's suppose that there was, for some reason, uh, an incredible flood of spending, not necessarily government spending. It could be consumption spending, investment spending, government spending. But let's suppose that there was a big flow of spending and the banks found themselves with lots of extra cash on hand, extra reserves. Uh, those, if it's just excess reserves, it's not necessarily earning them any, any good amount of money. They probably are going to seek to get some return on that money. One of the ways that they can do that is by lending that money overnight to other banks in the so-called federal funds market. But if all the banks have excess reserves and they're all seeking to lend, competition will drive down the price of that borrowing. It will drive down the overnight rate below the level that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is targeting. And consequently, excess reserves will tend to drive down the rate of interest that banks charge one another, which may contradict the policy objectives of the Federal Reserve. So what the Federal Reserve can do is to, one of the things that the Federal Reserve can do is to draw those reserves out of the system by offering to sell the bank's treasury bonds from its portfolio. And that at least, especially up to about 2008, that sort of activity known as open market operations was the principal way that the Federal Reserve intervened in money markets so as to preserve, to meet its monetary policy objectives. Now, that is more of the monetary policy wonkishness that I referred to in my opening remarks. And that's something that it's not something that I grasped the first time around, so I wouldn't expect you to grasp that around. But the main, the simple point here is that any country's central bank, or the central bank of any country that is monetarily sovereign, can really determine both the overnight interest rate, the federal funds rate that you, Lucas, were mentioning, but it can also, through various other mechanisms, control the spread of interest rates, including medium-term and long-term interest rates. Okay, next question. Explain why, if the U.S. government were to substantially reduce the national debt, the economy might fall into recession. Joe Bongiovanni, can you take a stab at that question?
Sorry. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So after all that, I have to ask you to repeat at least part of that question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Explain why, if the U.S. government were to substantially reduce the national debt, the economy might fall into a recession.
Well, just because of taking the certificates of indebtedness out of the portfolios of the investors that might want to be financing whatever they want to be financing.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
That's good.
If it's reducing the national debt, that means that the non-government sector has that has to be selling its holdings of treasury bonds, right? Uh, and if that is the case, the what the government is doing is draining flows of funds out of the non-government sector of the economy, just as uh, uh, this would have actually an even better example of that is if the government were to adopt a policy of reducing the national debt, say by increasing taxation, that would be draining income away from the non-government sector of the economy, and that would increase the risk of a recession. And in this chapter, uh, Stephanie Kelton discusses what happened in the United States in the 1830s when the federal government actually did pay off its national debt, and it led to the first first true national recession, the Panic of 1837. And she also describes the period in the late 1990s under the Clinton administration when the government was running budget surpluses in several successive years, and how that was draining money out of the private sector of the economy, which she says was not sustainable. At this point, uh, having done chapter 3, I noticed that there was articles in the press this week that were very pertinent to that, and there were articles concerning statements by the Biden administration that I found in both the Washington Post and the CBS News website. And I put the links to these articles in to the Slack channel. And so I'd like to spend a couple minutes now. We'll allocate maybe 10 or 15 minutes before we go on to the discussion questions for chapter 4. For anyone who actually read those articles, to discuss the recent Biden administration statements on the federal budget and the national debt as reflected in those articles. I guess at this point, I'll say, raise your hand if you want to comment on the Biden administration. This was actually President Biden's own statements and how they were discussed. Anybody want to take on that? Okay, well, maybe
I've
because
not had a chance to look at those articles, but I'd be quite interested to look at that because they're obviously pertinent. You know, I read the FT and the Financial and the Times in London, so we don't necessarily get those papers, but it's good to have the references actually. And I've only managed just to get into the Slack channel. I've had to reorganize my computer in some quite considerable ways to try and get access to that channel, but I'm on stream now, so so that's useful.
Let me just quote 2 paragraphs from the Washington Post article that appeared on May 4th, 5 days ago. President Biden said Wednesday that his administration will address ongoing concerns about inflation by paying down the national debt for the first time in 6 years, a sharp contrast from his predecessor, whose economic policies increased the country's debts annually. Quote, bringing down the deficit is one way to ease inflationary pressures in an economy where a consequence of a war and gas prices for oil, food, and it all, it's just a different world right this moment because of Ukraine and Russia, said President Biden on Wednesday. Okay, so I get to be a bit more specific. From the modern money theory point of view, or from Stephanie Kelton's point of view, what is problematic about President Biden's statement this past week? Anybody
Well,
want to take on
I
that?
think,
William Batt?
oh, okay.
William Batt, I see you have your hand raised in the participants window.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. I was going to comment on something else. That is, you've mentioned several times that lots of material that you have posted is on something called a flag channel, or
Slack.
also on what is it?
Slack.
What? Say that word again.
Slack. S-L-A-C-K.
Oh, slag. Slack. And also that it was on a Lerner Minsky channel or something.
Website.
I guess you're going to have have our moderator provide a link for these, because I've missed it 2 or 3 times in past sections, and I can't find it now.
Okay.
So that's what
we'll take care of that later. Right
Okay.
now, I want to see if anyone would like to comment on those on President Biden's statement as quoted in the Washington Post, and explain why it's problematic from an MMT point of view.
Well, I could mention that every time there's a debt, there's also a credit. And of course, if you're going to reduce the debt, you're also reducing the amount of credit. And I suppose it's this mistaken notion of the economy that we can, there's no circular flow. And so you're reducing the debt and you're reducing the whole flow of the economy.
Okay. Let's Ed Dodson. Would you like to comment on this topic?
I think there's a perspective on this that those of us who've studied Henry George would enter, and that is, as we're moving toward the crisis point in the current business cycle, by paying off debt, you're taking money out of investors' hands in one respect, in a risk-free investment, and those with a higher disposable income are going to then put that money in another type of investment. If it's equities, then it's in a speculation-driven market where there's much higher risk for loss, and I think that's part of the loss of balance that investors are looking for. And I mean, most investors would be looking for something like conservative growth, and now you're really forcing investors to move into a much more aggressive growth posture that has a much higher level of risk, not only for them as individuals, but for the economy as a whole, as we get toward the higher stress points in the cycle that could bring on a recession.
Okay.
Because interest rates were so low, people were buying stocks. Is that what you're saying, Ed? People
Yes.
investing a lot in stock.
Yes.
Yeah, and then now they're trying to put a brakes on that by raising interest rates. The stock market.
I think there's another point to this as well, and that is for those who are modest investors, a lot of senior citizens who would invest in government securities as risk-free and generating some interest income. The government's decision to purchase that debt and retire it means that those individuals who don't have the discretionary income necessarily to put in the stock market, they're going to lose interest income and they're going to lose disposable income. And so that segment of the economy is going to have much less spending power.
Okay. I'm really trying to focus on what modern money theory, so Stephanie Kelton, would find problematic in President Biden's remarks. Joe Polito, would you like to take on that?
Well, I feel like it's another trick question by you. Doesn't modern monetary theory say that it would prefer to raise taxes than to raise interest rates and unemploy people? Isn't that they often say taxes aren't really for raising government revenue, but it is good for fighting inflation.
Okay, that is true. That is a perspective shared by modern money theory. Uh, but what we're but President Biden is not talking there about raising taxes. He's not even directly focused on the question of interest rates. He was touting his administration's reduction of the federal deficit. Uh, and we're trying to get at the MMT perspective on that. Marty Rowland?
Yeah, thanks, James. I guess the polite way is say that Biden's got it ass backwards in terms of paying off the debt. There's less money going into increase the flow of goods and flow of funds to increase the business, manufacturing and purchasing. So it's actually harming the situation by increasing inflation, although he thinks that he's doing it to cure inflation.
Well, I'm not entirely clear what Biden is thinking. I don't want to presuppose that I understand, but yeah, I think you're getting to the point. One of the things that if you follow the discussion, particularly over the last year, you would see many sort of financial pundits and people like on the business cable channels saying, "Oh, the Biden administration, they're doing MMT," and they're going out in this crazy left-wing theory called modern money theory, and there's a lot of claims about this, but the fact that Biden is boasting that he's reducing the federal deficit, at least relative to the deficits that took place under the Trump administration, and that he thinks reducing the federal deficit in and of itself is a good thing, is clearly not modern monetary theory. It shows that he still believes that there are political gains to be made by appealing to the notion that Stephanie Kelton would characterize as, quote, sound finance. The notion that the federal government is being virtuous if it balances its budget just like a household does. The statements that Biden is making indicate that he and his administration, either they don't understand the concept of functional finance, or that they don't trust that the public can understand an explanation of policy based on the principles of public finance, and that we need to reinforce the household budget analogy, the false notion that we criticized in session 1 of this course. So I would urge you to go back and read those 2 articles, and of course, or any similar article that discussed what the Biden administration was saying, and try to go over in your own mind. Now, of course, you may have your own opinion, and you also may be able to criticize what Biden is saying from another perspective, such as like what Ed Dotson was saying, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just trying to ask you to use the MMT lens on what Biden was saying this past week, and to see that you understand why, from an MMT perspective, what Biden was saying was unwise. Uh, uh, and, and basically, if you can explain why MMT would be critical of Biden's statements in the past week, then you understand modern money theory, at least in the policy side of modern money theory. Okay.
I have a question, how modern monetary theory addresses short-term inflation. I don't know if it's long-term, but obviously the supply chain problem and gas because of the war in Ukraine. And then food's going to go sky high because Ukrainian crops are not around anymore because of the war. So food prices are going up globally. So how would modern monetary theory deal with that? Is that like later in the book? Like what's the best way to deal with that?
I'm not going to say that MMT has an answer for short-term inflation because I don't think anybody does. But and this, to a certain extent, we discussed this 2 weeks ago in the chapter on inflation. But the main thing, and this I get more from Stephanie Kelton's recent blog post than from the book, The Deficit Myth, is that any discussion of inflation has to begin with an analysis of the many different causes of inflation because they have to be dealt with individually. There's no answer that I can give you like a soundbite. There's nothing that, even if Stephanie Kelton were whispering in Joe Biden's ear, there is no soundbite response to how, we would deal with inflation. And it's more complex than we can really get into here. Is there anyone want to have a final comment on the statements of Biden before we go on to the chapter 4 questions? Paul Lebo.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, this is my first attending class here. I did read Kelton's book 1.5 times. I just want to point out that Kelton has a lot of good things to say, but a lot of things she says are questionable. So people need to keep their critical thinking hat on. And when you don't understand something, there may be a really good reason for that. So just don't take what she says as gospel and try and pick and choose. One thing, if you're going to lower the deficit, the only way you can do that if you're going to keep funding school education and Medicare and all that stuff is raise taxes. So that's basically what you have to do.
Let's go on to our discussion questions for chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Their Red Ink is Our Black Ink, and it deals with many of the same topics that we encountered in chapter 3, but from a somewhat different perspective. So let's start going to our discussion questions. Let's proceed through I'll keep going through the Zoom window. The first questions deal with explaining terminology. First term that Stephanie Kelton uses in chapter 4 is policy variable. Uslam, can you tell us what a policy variable is?
He said he's passing.
Okay. Cuba. Cuba, can you tell what Stephanie Kelton means by policy variable?
Yes. So policy variable, in her words at least, is that it's a policy choice that is not required for government to take. It is policy variable in the sense that government can take that policy decision or not. It's its choice. So she mentions that bond sales, for example, at least in the United States, are entirely voluntary. And the interest rate paid on any bonds that the government chooses to offer is always a policy choice. It is a policy choice because since the United States is a currency issuer, it has the freedom to say what was interest rate on the bonds, that it is offering, and that's why bond sales will be voluntary in the U.S. and they are it's a policy variable.
Okay, very good. That's a good description. The next term is crowding out. Neil H., can you say what Stephanie Kelton means by the crowding out theory?
That's if the government has a deficit, it increases interest rates for the private sector. Pretty much that's it. It because of competition for for loans.
Yep.
Okay. Yes, it's the crowding out theory is the notion that government borrowing, as it says, crowds out, tends to exclude borrowing in the private sector for investment purposes. And it turns out that the crowding out theory is very much connected to the next term that I asked to be defined, the loanable funds theory. Carlin, can you describe the loanable funds theory?
I can't, so I will stay tuned.
Okay. Ed Dodson, the loanable funds theory. Can you give a brief description of that?
This is the idea that at any time in the economy, there is a maximum amount of capital available for lending. And so it's the basis for competition between the public and private sectors.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So crowding out and the loanable funds theory, these are not modern money theory concepts. These are concepts in mainstream economics.
That's true.
Concepts that MMT is very critical of and does not, basically, they are theories that MMT does not believe are true. Okay, now here's a more difficult one. Stock flow consistency. Jeff, can you say what stock flow consistency is?
Sorry, can't read the book.
Okay. Norman Scott, stock flow consistency?
No, I'm not clear about that either.
Okay. Vicky, stock flow consistency. Can you take a stab at that? Okay, well, I admit this is probably one of the more difficult terms to describe. As I said, the material in the middle part of the book gets very wonky. But basically, if you think of the parts in the discussion there where she's discussing what she learned from the British economist Wynne Godley, who basically would construct models of the economy and whose slogan was that every payment must come from somewhere and go to somewhere. So a stock flow consistency would be a description of a model of the overall economy in which we make sure that every flow of spending from the government sector goes to the non-government sector and vice versa, and that for every deficit, every debt that someone holds, that is somebody's assets. Stock flow consistency. Okay, that's a difficult one to explain, so I won't belabor it. Okay, the final term that I'd like to get someone to describe is yield curve control. Patricia Lowe, can you describe what?
Yeah, I could take a stab at it because I remember just reading news generally that yield curve is like the I don't know, the ratio of the short-term government bonds to the long-term. So the government could actually intervene, like the Bank of Japan, and set the rate for both long-term and short term. So there, there might be no different, whatever. The government sets the rate, and that's the end of the yield curve.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. Now we're going to get the next question. Basically, asks you to think of those buckets in the that Kelton uses in chapter 4 of the book. Explain why, in a two-sector model of the economy, the sum of the financial balances of the government and non-government sectors must be zero. Let's see. Ruth, would you like to try that question?
Well, all the dollars the Federal Reserve creates for government spending has to be equal to the amount the public receives and pays back into the economy through taxes and through investments. So it's
Okay, that's mostly correct.
They've got to cancel each other out somehow. Yeah. So
Okay.
tricky.
Would anyone like to add to what Ruth has said on that?
This is Marty. It's simply that whatever comes out of one bucket goes to the other one. So when you add and subtract that, it comes out to be zero.
Yes. Yes. And when as I advised in my introductory remarks, when you sit down with your grandchildren and you draw those buckets, you will see the flow between the buckets. And ultimately, if the flows in one direction are labeled with a plus sign and the flows in the other direction are labeled with a minus sign, then the sum of those flows will be, by definition, be zero overall. It's an accounting identity, and it's a concept that is used a lot in MMT. Okay, the next question is one that we actually discussed earlier in tonight's session. Explain the role that federal government sales of treasury bonds play in managing interest rate levels. Peter Lugton, would you like to try that question?
Yeah, I was just reading that the sale of the bonds is equivalent to the yellow dollars, and when it sells those, it taking in the so-called green dollars, and it is manages the interest rates. I'm a bit confused about that.
Okay, okay. Anyone else want to take a stab at explaining how do federal government sales of treasury bonds play a role in managing interest rate levels?
I have a question because the answer presupposes what I'm going to say. The statement I got out of the book was selling U.S. treasuries and drawing reserve balances down. These would be the cash reserves because they buy the treasuries, would increase interest rates. So I'm assuming that the fractional reserve system, it actually has to do with dollars on deposit and not U.S. treasuries. There's dollars in the vault, the big safe that's as big as a room that's got dollars in it. And then they have less dollars in the vault for the basis of their loans. But I don't know if that's right or not.
Well, I would caution you against using the term fractional reserve system, because that's a theory of the banking system that MMT is very critical of.
But we do have it, I think. The federal government requires like what, 10% reserves, on the loans that they have. They have to have just as so they could send the money around, like prevent runs on banks and things or whatever. I don't know.
Okay, but the problem is that other countries, such as Canada, do not have a fractional reserve, do not have those sorts of reserve requirements that the United States does, and yet they manage their banking systems perfectly well. In fact, better than that of the United States. So I don't want to get into a big discussion of fractional reserve banking. That theory, that's a theory that MMT views as mistaken. But okay.
I'd like to take a shot at the question.
Okay.
And that is that the federal government, that the Federal Reserve determines the interest rate at which the bonds will be offered. So they sell the bonds at par. Once the bonds are sold, then a secondary market arises to determine whether or not investors accept that rate and whether they'll bid a a discount, or pay a premium based on the actual yield.
That's what I saw in the book. That sounded right.
Well,
yeah.
Let Jim answer. Tell me of what I'm wrong about.
Yeah, I'm not going to. There are certainly elements of what you said that are correct, and I don't claim to have the full response at my fingertips. The thing is that you're good. It's good that you're pointing out that it's actually the Treasury that sells the bonds initially.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I misstated.
The primary markets, and the Treasury auctions the bonds off, and they get a price for those bonds in that exchange, and implicit in the bonds are set for a certain amount and a certain length of time, and once you know the duration of a bond, and once you know the price that someone is going to pay, on initial issuance, which is discounted from what the bond will ultimately pay off as, then implicit in that is a long-term interest rate, a rate of return. Then so that's what the Treasury does. Once those bonds are in the secondary market, that's where the other people, including the Federal Reserve, can purchase those bonds or sell the bonds into the market, and that's the way in which, particularly when the Federal Reserve enters the secondary markets, and let's say they offer to purchase bonds
for their own account.
For their own account from the primary dealers or from the banks, then that means they're draining reserves from the non-government sector of the economy, and here this gets so complex that I lose my train of thought here. They can by the Federal Reserve, by buying and selling Treasury bonds from the banks, affects the amount of reserves in the system, and thereby ensures that the rate of interest in the system is close to the Federal Reserve's target rate.
I read that whole section, and you're absolutely right. It's why people make a lot of money at the trading desk.
Yes, yes, because following the train of causation through there, I mean, I cannot spit it out as I just demonstrated. It's something that you have to read several times and before you really
when I was still working at Fannie Mae, the guys that did our bond trading, they very kind of how can I say it, almost egotistically said that they were the guys who determined whether we made or lost money, and the rest of us were just overhead.
Yeah, now I've never worked in finance myself, so I can't speak from personal experience. In the meetup group that I have met with in New York City for several years, the Deficit Owls, we frequently get people who come by. This is assuming that we're meeting in a bar, and who work in finance, and it's like they have this hands-on experience that we don't have, and it's always enlightening. And of course, modern monetary theory basically arose because of Warren Mosler's experience in financial markets and in trading. He made a killing on the Italian lira back before the issuance of the euro, and it's the insights that he had there into these monetary operations that really gave rise to MMT. Um, okay, let's see. All right, we have two more questions. Suppose a country's government decided to pledge to convert its domestic currency into US dollars at a fixed exchange rate. Why would that government then have to give up control of its interest rates? There are a couple people I haven't called upon yet. I want to call upon everybody at least once. Ligaya Balse, can you tackle that question?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Suppose a country's government decided to pledge to convert its domestic currency into US dollars at a fixed exchange rate. Why would that government then have to give up control of its interest rates?
Oh, that's well, if a country decides to convert its currency to the US dollar, it practically gives up its financial sovereignty to the Federal Reserve.
Okay, okay, that's
And the
good.
banks, the local banks of that country, will have to participate in the open market operations as well.
Uh, okay. Um, uh, you, I like the fact that you talked about the a currency tying the fact that if a currency tied its the value of its current if a country tied the value of its currency to dollars at a fixed rate exchange rate, it would be giving up monetary sovereignty.
Yes.
Now, what we're looking for is just a little bit more information, a little bit more detail. Why would that government then have to give up control of its interest rates?
Uh, well, look, in the first place, let's say if it's in the case of the Philippines, interest rates can't really be controlled by regulators. I put a question first that I think what the monetary authorities decide on is how much of a bond float will they offer to the public, and then they offer it. They offer an auction. Now, it's possible that the local central bank, the government bank, will decide to float its own bonds, but because it's now pegged to the dollar, it will probably have to do the same thing. Let's say the Philippines, this or Australia decides to float bonds, right? Uh, it will have to conduct an auction in which the local and American banks will participate in setting the price and therefore the yield of the bonds. So really, I don't think that the government, the government regulators, the monetary authorities, don't have a, cannot set interest rates. What they can decide on is the volumes of a bond float, and in that way, that's how they somehow influence, but not set interest rates.
Okay, well, I think you're correct in that um, a central bank will be able to influence the level of interest rates in its country, depending in large part about its control of purchase or sale of bonds. Um, what we're specifically looking for is why a country that pegs its currency to the value of another currency is why its government, or its central bank is then unable to exercise good control over interest rates. Because is there anybody who would like to
I
take a
didn't they
stab at
do
that question?
didn't they actually do that with the euro? Because a lot of countries surrendered their currencies to
Yes.
the European Central Bank, and effectively, a lot they did not have. They only had one central bank, and what governments could do was only float bonds and conduct an auction and be at the mercy of that auction. That's
Okay.
how I
That
understood. That's the closest case I can think of that really happened.
and that is a valid case. That is a
Yes.
very valid case, where but that's a slightly different case in that there the European countries surrendered control of their currency. Their currencies cease to exist.
Yeah.
Uh, what we're trying to get at here is a bit different. It's a case of a uh, country that still continues to issue its own currency, but pledges to always be able to purchase and sell that currency against U.S. dollars at a certain rate. And we're trying to figure out what is the problem with that and control of interest rates. Patricia Lowe.
I think Russia's an example right now that they're supposed to, although they might, like in the last few weeks, they might have stopped converting to dollars, but until then, they were supposed to convert the ruble into dollars. And then, the ruble has really gone down, like due to sanctions and I guess dollars disappearing. But yeah, they're not. So in that respect, they're not a currency issuer, like even Russia, even Putin. But because they did peg it to the dollar, because I think people weren't that interested in rubles, like to buy stuff, because they can't buy anything with the rubles because they don't make anything. And this country's
Okay.
getting to be like that too, because I heard a guy on How I Built That talk about his mask industry, trying to be domestic, making masks. And he had a hell of a time because he couldn't get materials. He couldn't do everything because everything was China has all the materials and he got nowhere. And he's saying the US is losing its ability to manufacture stuff because they don't have skilled labor anymore because nobody's making anything anymore in the US. I mean, there's these structural problems, but
Okay.
the answer to the question about the setting the interest rates, that's Russia. And I think interest rates went sky high as a
Okay.
result.
I'll direct your attention to page 125 of Stephanie Kelton's The Death of Myths, where she does discuss Russia, but not Russia of 2022, the Russia of 1998, I believe, in which the Russian central bank got into trouble because it was trying to maintain a ratio, a fixed exchange rate with the U.S. dollar, and at a certain point, due to financial panic, everybody wanted U.S. dollars, and it exhausted the capacity of the Russian central bank to exchange them, and consequently, the price of as demand for Russian bonds evaporated, the price of Russian bonds collapsed, and yields rose sharply. That again, this is a bit more advanced material. It'll require you to, go back and forth reading it a couple times, but it's well worth it. Um, we're we're nearly at the end of our session. I'm going to actually cut discussion of the final question. The uh, uh, for next week we have two more chapters, chapters 5 and 6. The discussion questions will be posted in the Slack channel and on my website. Uh, if you refer to the email that you were sent when you registered for this course by the Henry George School, you should find uh, instructions about how to get the Slack channel and the and get the URLs for the website. Uh, and maybe if Ibrahim, if you could post in the chat room, the panel for the Zoom at this time, the uh, the URLs that would for the discussion questions, that would be helpful. Um, and the my introductory remarks from this week are already posted on my website, lerner-minsky.org. We have 3 minutes left. Anybody who would like to make an open comment on anything that we discussed in this week's session?
Yeah, I just remember there was a case in the Philippines when the peso was pegged to the US dollar, and that was pegged at 14-1. The effect was there arose a black market for US dollars that went as high as 28-1. Now, what the central bank governor did in order for the peso to not further fall in the informal market was to offer treasury bills that guaranteed a rate that matched the rate at which the Philippine peso was falling vis-a-vis the dollar. So that encouraged the banks to keep pesos, Philippine pesos, instead of instead of speculating further on the US dollar or the Philippine pesos fall. And well, that's another case that I wanted to share with everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's another aspect of the problem that essentially, for if a country like, let's say, the Philippines is trying to maintain a constant exchange rate with the U.S. dollar, it has to be prepared to buy and sell dollars at that rate whenever anybody shows up at the Philippine National Bank, which particularly if people want to buy dollars, that means the bank has to have dollars in the first place. It has to have those foreign reserves, and its ability to to get those foreign reserves is is likely to have an effect on domestic interest rates. Any one other final comment?
Well, I guess the answer to that last question, I guess you kind of covered it, but if a country is placing its currency and borrowing in another currency, then they've already given up the ability to influence interest rates, because the currency of that government that you put, like the U.S., they're already changing interest rates. So it's kind of ludicrous that they would think that they could control their interest rates if they're putting their eggs in the U.S. basket.
Yeah, I think that's really getting to the issue, that if you're pegging your currency to that of another country, that interest rate swings in that other country, which may be a result of central bank policy in that other country, are going to wash over your country, like a tsunami. And in fact, this was the problem in the United States before World War I, before the creation of the Federal Reserve System, that when everything was on the gold standard and basically the Bank of England uh, uh, was the administrator of the gold standard, and when the Bank of England raised its interest rates, gold would flow to the United Kingdom, and it would flow out of the United States, and it would cause a financial panic and changes of interest rates here. So the just it's not simply a question of tying your currency to gold. Now it's more a question of tying your currency to the U.S. dollar. This is something that we are likely to see in the next couple of weeks. What will happen in the economy of what we'll call third world countries in reaction to the recent increase in U.S. interest rates of the first 25 basis points and then 50 points. What you will see is that interest rates will have to rise in other countries that have their currencies pegged to the U.S. dollars, and those will probably adversely affect the economies of those countries. Okay, so I hope to see you again in 1 week at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Read chapters 5 and 6 in the Deficit Myth and work through the discussion questions.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. And I just shared the link to the Slack channel if you haven't joined yet. And Bill, I'm sending you one on your inbox. Thank you.
We're not able to copy the chat.
You click it.
Oh, okay. All right.
I clicked it, but it said my browser's not doesn't support Slack. So much for Slack for me, I guess.
All right.
Yeah. I have an older Mac. I can't even update the operating system because it doesn't.
In that case, I'm gonna email it to you, Patricia. Okay.
Yeah, me too. My operating system won't support it.
Okay.
Good to know this.
All right. So you may need to download the app itself then.
Yeah, if the app works on my MacBook, older MacBook. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Or use the browser interface, because with the browser, you may not need to download the app itself. You could just use the Google if you have Chrome, or I suppose it works with other browsers too.
I wish I could copy it because then I could get it on my phone, because I'm listening to this on my computer. If I could copy that link, I'd get it on my